Hey friends! Tonight we're stepping back into the flickering candlelit world of the Middle Ages, not to admire towering castles or royal courts, but to uncover something more intimate and eerie. How everyday people protected their homes without locks. No deadbolts, no alarms, just quiet rituals, strange symbols, and deeply rooted fear of what might slip through the cracks. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, immersive history. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing this little community span the globe. Now dim the lights, let the hush settle in, and let's drift gently into the secrets of the medieval threshold, leaving a broom propped across the door to ward off intruders. Imagine a quiet rural lane at the edge of a medieval village. The air is still, save for the distant cluck of hens and the soft rustle of wind through thatch. One cottage, nestled between low stone walls, seems utterly ordinary. Its door is shut, shutters drawn, chimney cold. But there is a broom, coarse-bristled, handle worn smooth with years of use, propped carefully across the door. To a passing stranger, it might seem an afterthought. To the locals, it said something very clear. This home may be empty, but it is not unguarded. Throughout much of pre-modern Europe, and in rural settlements across the world, the everyday broom carried a subtle language. More than a cleaning tool, it was often a marker of presence, intention, or warning. In some regions, it served as a symbol of domestic order. In others, like here, it was a quiet ward, part of a much older tradition of protective gestures that blurred the line between the practical and the supernatural. To understand the meaning of the broom across the door, you have to understand how vulnerability shaped daily life. In small agrarian communities, the absence of even one household member could place a home at risk. Locks were rare and crude. Doors, often wooden planks set on pegs, could be forced with little effort. And yet, theft was relatively uncommon, not because people lacked the means, but because of a complex tapestry of informal signals, mutual surveillance, and silent deterrence. The broom was one such deterrent. If a household needed to leave, to tend distant fields, to visit a nearby village, or simply walk for water, they might lean the broom sideways across the front door or brace it upright against the frame. It was a sign, like a folded letter left on the table, written in a language only the community understood. The message varied slightly by region, but the core meaning remained. This house is watched, this absence is temporary, and you will be noticed if you step inside. There was also an air of the uncanny to the practice. In some traditions, the broom was believed to carry a residue of the household spirit, the essence of the hearth. To cross a threshold marked by it was to violate more than property. It was to invite consequences that were not strictly earthly. Whether or not villagers truly feared supernatural retribution, the belief shaped behavior. Even those tempted by hunger or desperation might hesitate before testing such a boundary. But it was not only the broom's position that mattered. Its condition, orientation, even which bristles faced outwards could carry subtle meanings. In certain alpine communities, for instance, an upside-down broom leaning near the door might signal a death in the family. In the Scottish Highlands, a broom deliberately left bristle up was a charm against witches. And in Slavic villages, sweeping the doorstep before departure, and then laying the broom across it, was said to confuse ill-intentioned spirits, who would be forced to count every bristle before entering. This fusion of mundane and magical thinking was typical of life before modern surveillance and security. Where there were no locks, there were layers of meaning. The rhythm of village life depended on mutual recognition, not just of faces, but of signals. A kettle left cooling on a doorstep, a dog tied at the post, a window left just slightly ajar. All communicated status and intent. The broom was part of that quiet grammar of absence and presence. And crucially, the broom's power wasn't only symbolic. It was also social. Everyone knew what it meant, and everyone agreed, consciously or not, to uphold its authority. To violate that agreement was to risk more than a neighbor's scorn. It meant disrupting the delicate fabric of trust that bound the community together. Gossip would follow. Retribution might not be swift, but it would be certain. Not always in the form of punishment, but in the cold shoulder of exclusion, the quiet withdrawal of favors, the weight of disapproval that could last for seasons. In some households, especially those of elderly widows or childless couples, the broom across the door became a ritual. It marked not just an absence, but a presence elsewhere, a niece's cottage, a chapel service, a visit to market. It was a way of saying, I am still part of this place. Do not mistake my quiet for vacancy. Over time, the custom faded. As locks improved and population centers grew, such subtle signals lost their power. But the broom lingered in folk memory, appearing in songs, in stories, in children's games. Even today, echoes of the practice survive in certain rural areas, where the placement of tools or talismans at a door is still seen as a form of protection or respect. And perhaps it's worth considering why such a humble object held such weight. The broom, handmade, often from bound twigs or straw, crafted by the same hands that swept with it, was deeply tied to the hearth. It symbolized care, order, the invisible labor that kept life stitched together. To use it as a marker of absence was to trust that others understood its significance, that even in silence, its presence spoke volumes. So the next time you see an old broom leaning against a cottage wall or resting on a porch, imagine the quiet power it once held. Imagine a village where everyone knew each other's signals, where absence was never quite emptiness, and a simple tool at the threshold could guard a home better than any key. In the rhythm of their lives, meaning was often found in what was left unsaid, and in what was gently left at the door, marking doorposts with ash to warn off thieves and spirits. Imagine yourself walking through a narrow lane in a quiet medieval village. It's early morning, and the sky hangs heavy with mist. The stones under your feet are still wet from the night's rain, and smoke drifts lazily from the chimneys. Along the row of cottages, you notice something curious: dark smudges above many doorways. Not random, not graffiti, a deliberate mark, a streak of ash across the lintel. It looks simple, almost accidental, but this was no mere soot stain. In communities stretching across Europe and beyond, this practice, marking the doorway with ash, carried meaning both practical and spiritual. It spoke to those who passed by, to neighbors, to wanderers, even, they hoped, to spirits. Ash, the soft gray remains of fire, held a curious status in the medieval imagination. It was, in a way, both humble and sacred. To live in a house with a hearth meant that you had warmth, food, and a certain stability. Ash was the residue of those gifts. It clung to the iron pot and the wooden spoon. It settled into cracks in the stone floor. And yet, it was more than a byproduct. It was a material imbued with symbolic power. In homes where fires were tended daily, ash was always at hand. A woman rising before the sun might stir the embers of the hearth and sweep a fresh handful of ash into a bowl. With a finger, she would smear it across the lintel, just above the doorway. The mark might be a straight line, a simple cross, or something more obscure. The design varied, but the intention was consistent. The practical logic was straightforward. Ash on the doorway was a quiet sign. Someone lives here, someone who keeps a fire. To a traveler or passerby, it indicated recent activity. In a world before locks and alarm bells, that alone was useful. Thieves and mischief makers, in theory, might think twice before breaking into a house that clearly showed signs of life. But of course, this was only one layer. In a deeper sense, the mark was also a threshold charm, a ward against things less visible than bandits. It was a quiet appeal to forces beyond human understanding. Ash, you see, was believed to confuse, repel, or even weaken spirits, not by burning or harming, but by disrupting their ability to cross boundaries. A spirit or ill-intentioned presence, faced with a marked threshold, might hesitate. It might forget its purpose, or be reminded, simply, that it was not welcome, and so the door became more than a plank of wood. It became a line between two realms, inside and outside, safety and threat, the world of the living and the uncertain dark beyond. And that line was smudged with ash, day after day. You might wonder why ash held this role. Why not salt or water or herbs? In many traditions, ash was seen as the residue of transformation, something destroyed, reduced, and made pure by fire. In Christian communities, for instance, ash was part of ritual, pressed onto the forehead on Ash Wednesday, reminding the faithful of mortality. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. But even outside the church, fire's remains held quiet authority. Ash came from something once whole, now undone. It whispered of cycles, of cleansing, of rebirth. And it was humble, free, abundant, and easily spread with the fingers. In some regions, ash was mixed with water or animal fat to make a kind of paste. In others, it was used dry. Occasionally, it might be combined with herbs like rosemary or mugwort, both known for their protective associations. A few households added symbolic lines or runes, depending on the local tradition. In Slavic regions, a woman might whisper a prayer while applying it. In parts of rural England, the act was done in silence, never discussed aloud, as if speaking of protection might invite danger. And the danger, to them, was real. Not just from wandering spirits, but from malice, the evil eye, curses, stray ill will from neighbors. All these things, they believed, could drift across thresholds as easily as wind. A smear of ash, it was hoped, would stop them. This belief wasn't limited to Europe. Similar practices existed in parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, though the materials and meanings varied. In some Indian villages, for example, households would mark doorways with soot or cow dung for purification. In Egypt, certain eras saw protective glyphs painted above doorframes. The instinct was the same. Mark the entrance, guard the home, blur the line between this world and what lay beyond. Back in the medieval village, these marks blended into the fabric of daily life. You might not even notice them after a while, like the sound of the blacksmith's hammer or the smell of fresh bread. They became part of the rhythm. But to those who lived within those walls, the gesture was meaningful, a comfort, a ritual, a habit passed down, often from mother to daughter, or from elder to child. And yet, it was not always consistent. In times of war, plague, or famine, the ash mark might take on new meaning. Some believed it could ward off disease, or at least signal to others that the house was already afflicted, a kind of unspoken quarantine. In desperate seasons, ash might be smeared thicker, darker. Some marks became frantic, layered over and over, as if protection could be built like a wall. Others let the ritual slip away, a sign of losing faith, or simply of forgetting in the press of hunger and hardship. Still, even in decline, the practice left traces. Old wooden lintels discovered centuries later sometimes bear strange streaks or soot-stained grooves. Historians puzzle over their origin. Were they decorative, functional, or the faded remains of a forgotten ritual? Once performed each morning in silence, with ash from the hearth and a quiet hope that it might keep the world at bay? In a way, it's not so different from the things we do today. Locking doors, leaving porch lights on, hanging certain objects or signs near the entrance. Small gestures, habits, comforts, signals to the seen and unseen. So the next time you pass an old cottage, with smoke curling from the chimney and a weathered beam above the door, look closely. You might see nothing, Or you might notice a mark, just a faint trace, a line of ash, long since faded. But once it meant something. Once it stood between the warmth of the hearth and the cold uncertainty outside. And someone, long ago, pressed their finger to that ash and made it mean safety, placing iron tools near entrances to repel mischievous spirits. Imagine yourself standing before a modest medieval cottage at dusk. The roof is thatched with straw, the walls wattle and daub, and the air carries the quiet weight of wood smoke and cooling soil. The day's labor is done. Chickens settle under the cart. A curl of steam drifts from a cooking pot left to rest. And just beside the wooden door, tucked carefully into the earth, is something you might not notice at first. A rusted pair of iron tongs, or perhaps an old scythe blade turned edge down toward the threshold. It isn't for farming. It isn't for convenience. It's there as a guard of sorts, silent and unmoving. Iron, to those who lived in centuries long past, was not merely a tool of function, but a symbol of invisible power. And the doorway, always the boundary between what is yours and what waits outside, was a place where such power might be most needed. In many parts of Europe during the late medieval and early modern period, placing iron objects near the entrance of a home was a common practice to ward off malevolent spirits, witches, or even envious neighbors who might bring ill fortune. The belief stretched across regions and classes, from the lowliest tenant farmer to the village wise woman. Iron, after all, was believed to cut through more than just wood or wheat. It was thought to sever the very passage between the material world and the unseen. There were many reasons to be cautious in these times. Life was lived close to the land, close to death, and close to the unknown. Illness arrived without warning. Crops could fail without cause. A child who laughed at breakfast might fall feverish by sunset. In such a world, any protection, however symbolic, was worth preserving. Iron became a kind of boundary object, sharp, durable, and forged by fire. It carried a reputation for honesty and clarity. Where wood might warp, iron stayed true. Where cloth might rot, iron endured. And when it came to unseen forces, spirits that might slip under the doorframe or ride the draft of a chimney, iron was thought to interrupt their passage, as if the very essence of metal could confuse or repel their formlessness. The practice had variations. In some places, blacksmith's tongs were preferred, their shape resembling a protective claw. In others, a horseshoe, curved and nailed upside down, was affixed above the door. Some households placed a blade, like a sickle or small knife, under the doormat or just behind the lintel beam. What mattered was not the exact shape, but the presence of the metal itself, an old, rust-tinged sign that this house was not unguarded. It wasn't just ghosts or witches that people hoped to deter. Iron was also believed to discourage the evil eye, a kind of curse brought on by jealousy or malicious glances. Neighbors, after all, were both allies and potential threats. A poorly timed compliment on your fine cabbages or healthy baby might be taken as a subtle jinx. Placing iron near the entrance was a quiet signal. Here, the line is drawn. Blacksmiths, in this worldview, held a strange and elevated status. Their trade required not only strength, but a near-magical ability to master fire, metal, and transformation. To bend cold or into a tool or a weapon was to participate in an alchemical mystery. Many believe that a blacksmith's tools, having been born in fire, retained a kind of spiritual potency. Even their cast-offs, their broken pliers or discarded nails, might serve as amulets if placed correctly. Children were sometimes protected with iron as well. A pin hidden in a baby's swaddling, or a nail slipped beneath the cradle, was thought to prevent changelings. Fairy children left in place of stolen human infants. Doorways, again, were key. The act of crossing from one realm to another, from outside to in, from stranger to kin, was always a moment of risk. And yet, despite these beliefs, it's important to remember that they were woven into the rhythm of daily life, not set apart from it. A scythe beside the door was not necessarily alarming. It might be used one morning in the fields and returned later to its post. Iron's dual role, both practical and spiritual, made it uniquely suited to this quiet defense. There was no need for ceremony. Its presence was enough. Over time, the meaning softened. In some regions, placing iron tools near a doorway became a custom more of habit than fear. Like many superstitions, it endured even when belief faded. A grandmother might place an old blade near the porch, just in case. The way others might knock on wood or toss salt over a shoulder. It became part of the landscape, half prayer, half precaution. In the present day, the practice has largely disappeared, surviving only in fragments and folklore. But traces remain. The horseshoe, once a talisman nailed above countless doors, is still seen in rural homes or stylized into good luck charms. And the image of iron as protection lingers quietly in language and tradition. We speak of iron wills and iron boundaries. We trust that which is forged, solid, and enduring. So, as the fire dies low and the night presses softly at the edges of the room, imagine again that quiet cottage. The scythe leans just so. The latch clicks shut. Somewhere in the woods, an owl stirs. The iron, though it makes no sound, stands watch. Not to threaten, not to harm, but to divide, gently and firmly, the world of the known from the world beyond the threshold. And for those who live their lives by hearthlight and hope, that was sometimes enough. Using string charms to confuse those who wished harm. Imagine a small wooden cottage, nestled near the edge of a lowland village. The door creaks gently as it swings in the morning breeze. Outside, the world is waking. Roosters crowing, cows shifting in their stalls, hearth smoke curling into the damp dawn air. And hanging quietly beside the doorframe, unnoticed by most, is a length of string, knotted, looped, and twisted in a deliberate, almost ceremonial fashion. It doesn't look like much, just a fraying cord, darkened with age, maybe adorned with a single bead or a dried sprig of rosemary. But to those who lived in medieval and early modern Europe, these quiet tangles of string could mean the difference between a protected home and one vulnerable to malice. They were called witch knots, and their purpose? To confuse. The idea might seem strange now, that a thief or witch, someone bent on mischief, might pause at the sight of a knotted string, might hesitate, might forget their purpose entirely. But this belief wasn't rooted in whimsy or mere decoration. It came from a deeper worldview, one in which intentions, spirits, and spells could be snared like fish in a net, tangled before they ever reached their mark. In many parts of rural Europe, particularly in regions where folk customs held strong sway, people believed that hostile intentions could be deflected, not through force, but through confusion. The logic was simple, if a bit magical. Malevolent forces, whether supernatural or simply ill-meaning neighbors, relied on clarity. They needed to know exactly what they were doing. A burglar had to have a plan. A witch had to recite her curse. But if the door was protected by a carefully tied charm, one with looping knots, deliberate patterns, even mirrored strings, then their thoughts might falter. They might forget the incantation. They might walk away mid-step. Their intentions, so carefully sharpened, would scatter like leaves in wind. Not magic or cord magic is one of the most ancient forms of folk protection. Long before printed books or formal spells, people used simple materials, twine, thread, animal sinew, and later wool or linen, to create symbolic barriers against harm. The knots acted as traps, not for the body, but for the mind, for the will. Each twist represented a turning of fortune. Each tie held back a threat. Sometimes these strings were dyed red, a color thought to repel envy and curses. Other times, They were left plain but tied in groups of 3, 7, or 9. Numbers that held sacred or symbolic value across many cultures. And they weren't always hung by doors. Some were tucked under eaves, buried beneath thresholds, or sewn into clothing. Shepherds sometimes tied them around the necks of their animals, while midwives wove them into birthing belts. But the doorway knots, those were special. They served as the household's first defense, a silent watchman whose only weapon was confusion. These practices weren't confined to Europe alone. In parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, similar traditions emerged. Cords tied with small bells, bones, or bits of colored fabric. In Japan, omamori charms carried in silk pouches sometimes used cords with symbolic knots. In each case, the goal was similar: to catch something intangible, to tie down what cannot be seen. The charm wasn't just protective, it was also participatory. Often, the knots had to be tied with a focused intention. A woman worried about gossip might tie 9 loops while whispering a protection prayer. A farmer fearing theft might knot his cord while watching the moon rise, aligning his actions with celestial rhythms. The act of tying was itself a kind of spell. Over time, these charms could grow into dense little artifacts. A single knot became 2, then 10. Some had objects tied into them. Teeth from animals, bits of broken iron, fragments of eggshell. They weren't meant to look beautiful. They were meant to interrupt. One prevailing belief held that witches, especially, could not pass a knot without attempting to untie it. And while they did, their spell would stall. Some tales suggest that the knots needed to be unpicked in the exact order they were tied, or the spell would unravel entirely. Whether the witch ever reached the end, well, perhaps that's why the charm worked. And if this seems quaint, it's worth remembering that we still do something similar today. Think of dream catchers hung to filter nightmares. Think of the red strings tied around wrists in certain traditions to ward off the evil eye. Even something as simple as a tied ribbon to remember a lost loved one. These are echoes of an older logic, one in which string is not just string. It's memory, it's intention, it's protection. Now, imagine the rhythm of daily life in a village where everyone used such charms, where doors didn't just creak open, they guarded, where a child might learn the family not pattern like a nursery rhyme, where peddlers selling bright cords were not just merchants, but keepers of silent power. In wealthier homes, the practice might fade, replaced by locks, bolts, and reinforced doors. But even among the elite, the notion of symbolic barriers persisted. Some manor houses displayed intricate heraldic rope patterns carved into stone lintels. Some noble women wore girdles, decorative belts, tied with knots said to grant health, fertility, or spiritual purity. With the rise of Christianity in Europe, many of these practices were adapted or obscured. Knotted cords might be blessed by a priest, or paired with a cross to give them legitimacy. Yet their purpose remained. Even when renamed as prayer ropes or holy bindings, they still carried the echoes of an older, quieter fear. That something unseen might cross your threshold, unless you confused it first. Eventually, as folk customs gave way to more formal religion and modern technology, the practice dwindled. People laughed at the idea that a burglar would be stopped by a bit of twine, but some rural households kept the knots anyway, just in case. A grandmother might refuse to let one be cut, even if she no longer remembered why it was tied. And in that lingering presence, you find the heart of it. These string charms weren't about stopping the world. They were about slowing it down, about placing one last, humble puzzle between yourself and the unknown. Not to fight, just to delay, just long enough for morning to come. So next time you see a bit of string hanging by an old door frame, perhaps frayed, perhaps forgotten, don't dismiss it too quickly. It might just be an old protection, a tangled whisper from a time when knots were spells and confusion was safety. scattering sand in a line across the threshold. Imagine a simple doorway, wooden, weathered, with a low lintel and a creaking hinge. The home beyond it is modest. Stone or wattle walls, a thatched roof, the faint scent of ash and stew lingering in the air. Yet across this unassuming threshold lies something curious. A thin, even line of sand, carefully poured from one side to the other. Not dumped, not scattered, but drawn with attention, like a seam stitched between two worlds. In many parts of pre-modern Europe, especially in rural communities where superstition and survival were tightly interwoven, this ritual line of sand served both a practical and spiritual function. On one hand, it was a rudimentary security system, clear evidence if someone or something had crossed the boundary during the night. On the other hand, it was a quiet form of defense against unseen intrusions. Spirits, witches, even ill intentions. Many were believed to be halted or at least revealed by the sand. The idea was not that sand could physically stop a person or entity, of course, but it might expose them. Human footprints, of course, would press into the soft dust. But folklore held that unnatural forces could not cross such a line without leaving their mark. Not necessarily in the form of visible tracks, but through disturbance, displacement, or eerie absence. There's an old belief, found in variations across Germanic, Slavic, and Celtic traditions, that malevolent beings, witches, fae, spirits, had to count things compulsively. Much like the stories of scattering seeds to delay a vampire, sand served as a trap of enumeration. A trail too tedious to ignore. A puzzle that would halt their advance long enough to protect the home within. Imagine a spirit arriving in the night, drawn to the warmth of a dwelling, only to be delayed endlessly by the need to count each grain of sand before crossing. The belief wasn't about violence or battle. It was about hesitation, interruption, delay. In a world where the door was your only true defense, even a moment's pause could mean survival. Daily life in these households was built around layers of such quiet protections. Many of them doubled as chores or customs. You tended the fire not only to stay warm, but because fire was sacred. Its constant flame warded off disease and spirits alike. You swept the threshold, not just for tidiness, but to remove traces that might be used in a charm against you. And you scattered sand, slowly, silently, before night fell, its texture catching the last amber rays of light before the door was latched. To the modern eye, this practice might seem quaint or decorative, but it was rooted in a worldview where the boundaries between physical and metaphysical were porous. Illness could come from a chill wind, or from a curse. Misfortune might be due to bad harvest or a jealous neighbor. The sand was a whisper of control in an unpredictable world. Some chose ashes instead of sand, especially if the hearth was active and the household too poor to spare anything clean. Others used crushed eggshells, dried herbs, or powdered chalk. The materials varied, but the logic was the same. Trace the line. Define the edge. Mark where the known ends and the unknown begins. These lines also offered an informal record-keeping system. A head of household might check the trail at dawn. Were there boot prints before anyone else awoke? Had the breeze disrupted it strangely, in a way that didn't feel natural? In regions with tensions, political or personal, the line of sand offered a sense of agency. A message, perhaps. I am watching who comes and goes. This kind of boundary marking has echoes far beyond rural cottages. Even ancient Roman households featured protective thresholds. The limen, the literal word for threshold, was sacred, often guarded by household deities called Laras and Penates. Offerings were placed at the door. Salt, grain, wine. A spiritual customs post, as it were, between street and sanctuary. In early Christian Europe, some of these beliefs were reinterpreted rather than erased. Clergy might bless a doorway or inscribe crosses on it during certain holy days. But older habits persisted alongside. Sand across the threshold became one of many quiet negotiations between the visible world and the invisible one. Over time, some of these traditions blurred into local folklore or were absorbed into children's games. Drawing lines in dust, tracing symbols in the dirt. It's easy to forget how these small gestures once carried weight. They weren't just play. They were echoes of something older. A memory held not in words, but in repeated movements. Silent, slow, careful. In larger towns, these habits became less visible. Doors were more solid, and neighbors more numerous. But even then, versions survived. Some innkeepers scattered flour across their thresholds, not for ghosts, but for thieves. If a drunken guest returned after curfew or a stranger crept in, the traces would speak for themselves by morning. Sand became evidence, not magic, but perhaps the distinction wasn't so sharp in the minds of those who used it. Even in places where belief in spirits had waned, the practice lingered in the language. To draw a line between oneself and danger. To sweep the doorstep before rest. These phrases have roots not only in cleanliness or social decorum, but in a kind of inherited memory. A sense that home must be marked off from the world. And so, you can picture it. A woman in a long wool tunic, kneeling at twilight, her fingers wrapped around a cloth pouch of coarse brown sand. She moves slowly, steadily, leaving a fine trail just before closing the door. No words spoken, no audience, just the hush of evening, the crackle of hearth fire inside, and the crunch of sand meeting earth. Tomorrow, the line will be swept, scattered, replaced. It is a daily ritual, but not a routine. It is a soft boundary in a hard world. Some mornings, nothing disturbs it. Other days, something strange lingers. A scuff where no one should have stepped. A curve that seems drawn, not accidental. But nothing is said aloud. The sand is swept, and life resumes. Because in that time, suspicion was not always voiced. Danger did not always wear a name, and protection was often as thin and fragile as the dust beneath your feet. Perhaps you've walked across such a line yourself, without knowing. A trail of dust, a crease in the floor. Maybe you paused, just for a second, just long enough for it to work, hanging rowan branches above the door for protection. Imagine a small cottage nestled in a green, rain-washed valley. Its thatched roof still damp from the morning mist, its walls thick with whitewash, its wooden door closed against the wind. If you looked closely above the doorframe, you might notice something subtle. A small sprig of reddish twigs tied neatly with red thread and tucked into the lintel beam. It was not placed there for beauty, nor forgotten by accident. It was Rowan, hung with care to guard against what could not be seen. For centuries, Rowan was not just another tree, known also as mountain ash. It held a reputation that passed quietly through generations, whispered from grandmother to child, from hedge witch to farmer. With bright red berries, delicate star-like blossoms, and feathered leaves, the Rowan was both familiar and mysterious. And among many peoples of northern Europe, from the highlands of Scotland to the glens of Ireland and the dark woods of Scandinavia, it was considered sacred. Above the door, a single Rowan branch served as silent sentinel, tied with red thread, often wool, and sometimes taken from clothing worn by a loved one. The twig formed a charm so commonplace it rarely required explanation. Those who passed beneath it did so with an unspoken understanding. This was a place protected. Why Rowan? Part of the answer lies in its appearance. The tree's bright red berries, rarely seen in great abundance, were thought to carry the essence of fire, an element feared and revered in equal measure. In folklore, red was the color of life, of blood, of warmth, and of boundary. Red marked thresholds between the worlds, between the living and the dead, the home and the wilderness, the seen and the unseen. Rowan wood was also unusually strong for such a small tree. Its grain ran straight, it resisted warping, and it could be carved into tools, walking sticks, or protective amulets. Shepherds sometimes carried Rowan staffs to guard flocks, and small discs of Rowan were sewn into clothing or placed near the hearth. But it was the doorway that mattered most, where the outside world met the safety of the home. In this way, Rowan became the tree of the threshold. Storms might batter the land, and illness might circle silently from cottage to cottage, but the sprig of Rowan above the door was a promise. This household sees, this household honors, this household resists. The practice of hanging the branch was not done casually. It was often tied during specific times of year, especially around the spring equinox or the May festival of Beltane. Some households renewed their Rowan charm every year in a quiet, deliberate ceremony. No grand procession, no firelight or song, just a moment at dawn or dusk when the world felt thinnest and the new twig was tied to replace the old. Sometimes, the previous year's sprig would be burned in the hearth, returning its protection to the flames that warmed the home. Other times it would be buried at the edge of the garden, forming a quiet perimeter against misfortune. These rituals varied by village, by family, even by season. But the underlying rhythm was the same. The old must be let go, and the new must take its place, with care and attention. Some believed that Rowan could guard against more than weather or sickness. It was said to ward off curses, witches, and ill-willed travelers. In places where old superstitions ran deep, a visitor who failed to acknowledge the Rowan over a door might be viewed with suspicion, or, at the very least, with quiet wariness. And if the branch ever fell or was found snapped, it was seen not merely as damage, but as an omen. Something had been resisted, or something had tried to enter, and failed. And yet, for all its mystical reputation, Rowan's protection was not about fear. It was about belonging, to the land, to the season, to the fragile hope that a family could keep its footing through the year ahead. In that sense, the branch above the door was less of a barrier and more of a blessing, not a rejection of the world, but an invitation to peace within it. In some households, especially among older generations, the tying of the Rowan was accompanied by murmured phrases or small gestures, touching the lintel 3 times, turning sunwise before stepping back inside. These were not spells in any formal sense. They were simply motions passed down over time, half-remembered rituals that made the moment feel complete. And even as the world modernized, as hinges grew stronger and doors gained locks and electricity banished the dark corners, many still kept the tradition, in part out of respect for their elders, in part for the comfort it gave, and in part because there remained that quiet, persistent sense that some protections are older than reason, that certain trees remember more than we do. So if you ever come across a Rowan tree, growing along a hillside, its berries bright against the gray, know that you are looking at something that was once sacred. And if you see a small red-tied sprig hanging above a door, pause. Take a moment. You've just stepped into a home where someone, long ago or just this morning, chose to keep watch with quiet ceremony. There is safety here, not because danger does not exist, but because something has been honored, something has been tended. In the rhythm of their lives, protection was not a fortress. It was a gesture, a branch, a thread, a moment at the threshold, carving cross marks into beams to seal out evil. Imagine a quiet rural lane, where cottages stand low and crooked, their timber frames settling gently into the earth with the weight of generations. The doorways are narrow, the beams darkened by age and smoke. And if you step close, closer than most ever bother, you might notice something etched into the wood. A small mark, sometimes weathered, sometimes freshly carved, almost always a cross. Not grand, not ornamental, just 2 short lines, meeting at right angles, dug into the grain of oak or elm, often just above the doorframe, sometimes on the inner lintel, sometimes near the windows or hearth, but always carved with purpose. These cross marks, simple, deliberate, and quietly powerful, were once among the most common defenses against the unseen. They weren't for decoration. They weren't declarations of belief. They were barriers, wards, seals scratched into the very bones of a home to keep out what could not be seen, but was deeply feared. In the medieval mind, evil did not only arrive in the form of war or hunger. It could come in whispers, in shadows, in moments when the wind blew oddly or animals stirred at nothing. Spirits, curses, witches, these weren't metaphors. They were part of the world, woven into its fabric. And where the fabric grew thin, at thresholds, corners, beams, they believed such things could slip through. The cross, in its simplest form, was understood to repel, not necessarily through doctrine or formal prayer, but by its shape alone. Two intersecting lines, forming four quarters. A symbol of balance, of protection, of the divine made geometric. To carve it into wood was to fix it into place, like a nail driven between worlds. It wasn't only churches that bore these marks. Far from it. In fact, the humblest homes, those built from thatch and timber with dirt floors and open hearths, were the most likely to carry them, because these were the homes most vulnerable to misfortune. Disease could arrive in a night. A cow might die, a child fall ill, a harvest fail. And with few explanations at hand, people turned to small rituals, quiet protections, subtle marks that said, "Not here, not this house." The carving was often done with a small blade, a knife used for daily chores, or even a farming tool repurposed for the task. There was rarely ceremony, no gathering of neighbors, no chanting, just a moment, often private, where the inhabitants stood before the wood and made the mark. Once, twice, 4 times a year, perhaps, at the turning of seasons, around feast days, or when misfortune felt too close. And over time, these marks accumulated. Some beams bore dozens, layered faintly over each other. Others were refreshed each spring. The old lines retraced until they grew deep and smooth. In places, a child might trace them idly with their finger, not knowing when they were made or why, only that they were always there. Interestingly, these cross marks were not always Christian, at least not in the institutional sense. While the church certainly embraced the cross as a sacred emblem, rural traditions often used it in older, broader ways. Before the spread of formal doctrine, the intersecting lines already held power. Echoes of ancient solar symbols, of seasonal cycles, of the meeting point between sky and earth. What mattered most was the belief that the cross worked, that a malevolent presence, seeing it carved into wood, would turn away. Not because it was frightened in the way humans are, but because the mark disrupted its purpose, confused it, rendered it powerless. Some homes had crosses carved on both sides of the threshold, outside, to prevent entry, and inside, to ensure anything that did enter could not remain. Others placed them near windows, especially if a death had occurred recently, or if rumors of witchcraft stirred through the village. Craftsmen, too, sometimes added these marks. A carpenter building a new beam might etch a small cross into the wood before raising it, not as a signature, but as a shield. It wasn't uncommon for barns to bear them as well. Livestock were vulnerable, after all, and could be afflicted by strange fits or wasting illnesses no healer could explain. You'll find similar marks across the British Isles and Northern Europe, sometimes as simple crosses, other times as star-like daisy wheels or overlapping X shapes. These too served as apotropaic symbols, which is just a scholarly term for things meant to ward off evil. But the plain cross endured. It was quick to make, easy to remember, and deeply embedded in the cultural fabric. Over centuries, many of these marks wore away. Beams were painted over, door frames replaced. But in old buildings, farmhouses, chapels, even some inns, they're still there. Look closely, and you'll see them, not in the center of attention, but off to the side, faint, Waiting. In modern times, they're often misinterpreted. Tourists might think they're carpenter's marks or decorative flourishes. Even some preservationists catalog them with dry labels. Ritual Protection Mark 14C. But if you lived in the time they were made, you wouldn't have needed an explanation. You would have known, because your mother made them. Your grandfather too. You would have seen the knife come out on a quiet morning, and though no one spoke of it loudly, you would have felt a little safer once it was done. So picture that quiet cottage again. Low roof, warm hearth, creaking floorboards. And above the door, a line cut into the beam. Not to impress, not to proclaim, but simply to keep the wrong things out. A gesture of care, a whisper of fear, a symbol, not shouted but carved, patiently, privately, into the wood and into the rhythm of daily life. And when the wind howled at night, or when the shadows stretched strangely across the fields, you might look to that mark and breathe just a little easier, leaving a lamp burning when absent to suggest occupation. The evening settles slowly in the countryside. Smoke rises from scattered chimneys, curling lazily into the heavy blue of twilight. Chickens have long since returned to their roosts. Doors are barred, and along a winding track, barely a road at all, a traveler passes a small stone cottage. From its single front window, a faint, steady glow flickers behind oiled parchment or warped glass. There is no movement, no sound, yet the light suggests presence. Someone must be home, but they are not. In many parts of early modern Europe, and in centuries both before and after, the quiet decision to leave a lamp burning when one stepped away from home was more than a matter of habit. It was a subtle act of protection, against thieves, against spirits, and perhaps most of all, against curiosity. To understand why, it helps to consider the nature of a home in a world without locks that truly locked, without reliable constables, and without much separation between the living and the unknown. A home was not merely shelter. It was a boundary. It divided what was yours from what was not. And when that boundary was left unattended, unguarded, dark, and still, it invited risk. The glow of a lamp offered an illusion, an intentional one. Its flicker implied warmth, movement, company, a whisper that someone was inside, even if no one truly was. In towns and rural villages alike, homes were porous things. Many had doors that creaked on wooden pegs or curtains for windows instead of glass. People came and went often without privacy, but absence, complete absence, left a space vulnerable. Whether the threat was practical, like wandering thieves, or imagined, like spirits or witches that crept through doorways in the dark, the idea was the same. Where there was light, there was life. And where there was life, there was resistance. Oil was not cheap. Candles, even less so. To leave one burning when no one was home was a choice, not an oversight. In some cases, it may have been a single ember left glowing in a hanging lamp, carefully shielded to reduce risk. In others, a stub of rushlight set behind a pane or a slit in the shutters. It need not burn bright, just enough to be seen. Among certain households, especially in the colder months, it was customary to position the lamp near the window before leaving. Subtly placed, not overt, as if to say, this house is watched. This hearth is not cold. This place is not empty. There were layers to the message. The visible glow signaled on the surface that a resident might be nearby. But to those with different beliefs, the light had symbolic weight as well. A lamp or flame was often associated with the soul, the essence of human warmth and presence. Its flicker was thought to repel spirits that fed on loneliness, or to trick ill-meaning forces into thinking they were not welcome. In some parts of England and the Germanic countryside, stories spread of homes left unlit and unattended becoming the targets of fairies or malicious wandering dead. A fireless hearth, to the old tales, was an invitation. Leaving the lamp burning was a kind of polite lie, a theatrical gesture of occupancy that discouraged mischief from both the living and the not quite. Of course, there were dangers. Fire was not easily contained. A toppled lamp could mean more than lost oil. It could mean the end of the home itself. That risk was calculated. Often, the lamp was hung from a beam or placed in a niche carved of stone or hardened clay. Some wealthier households built small recesses into their front walls specifically for this purpose. A niche just deep enough to cradle a candle, protected by horn or thickened glass. In time, the practice evolved. In towns, particularly in the later centuries, the idea of lighting a lamp in the window remained even after real threat diminished. It became symbolic, a gesture of welcome, a sign to travelers, or to loved ones returning late, that someone was waiting. During long absences, harvest trips, market days, journeys on foot, neighbors might be asked to tend the lamp. This wasn't merely a favor of kindness, but a shared understanding. A house that glowed, even faintly, gave the impression of continuity. It dissuaded those who might be tempted. In close-knit communities, one neighbor's lamp was often seen as part of the street's fabric, as much for the safety of all as for the family who owned it. Superstitions mingled freely with practicality. In some regions, it was believed that a dark home attracted gossip just as easily as ghosts. A house seen repeatedly unlit might earn unwanted attention. Questions about illness, abandonment, or worse. A small light protected not only the house's walls, but its reputation. And in deeply religious communities, the light had theological echoes. It symbolized the watchfulness of a household, the endurance of its faith. A flame that burned through the dark night could be interpreted as a kind of domestic piety, a sign that even in absence, the household kept spiritual vigil. For all these reasons, the simple act of lighting a lamp when one left home persisted for generations. And though the world eventually changed, though locks became stronger, neighbors became fewer, and belief in ghosts began to dim, the symbolism lingered. Even now, in some parts of the world, you might find a light left on when someone is away. A porch bulb, a hallway lamp, a glow from behind a curtain. The logic is the same. It says, I may not be home, but someone is watching. And perhaps, in some way, someone is. So if you ever find yourself walking down a quiet country lane or pausing outside a shuttered cottage late at night, and you notice the faint, flickering glow of a single light, know that it is more than illumination. It is a message from across the centuries, a quiet reassurance that this place is not forgotten. That absence does not mean abandonment, and that, even in the hush of night, the home still breathes. Setting shoes facing outward as a quiet warning. Picture an old cottage door at twilight. The sky is dimming, painted in soft strokes of blue and lavender. A gentle breeze nudges the grass, and the air carries the quiet hush of fields settling in for the night. Just beneath the wooden lintel, placed with care on the doorstep, sit a pair of worn leather shoes. Heels nestled close to the threshold, toes pointed outward. They're not left there by accident. They've been positioned deliberately, almost ceremonially. A sign to those who know how to read it. In parts of rural Europe, and in scattered traditions from other corners of the world, the act of placing shoes outside the doorway, toes facing outward, was a quiet kind of signal. Not a message shouted, not even spoken, but understood by those who believed in the unseen layers of daily life. The shoes, you see, weren't just for walking. They were guardians. The belief worked on two levels. First, for the human eye. A stranger approaching a home might see the shoes and pause. Something about the arrangement, the neatness, the direction, the deliberate placement, gave the impression that someone had just stepped out or might return at any moment. Even if the cottage was quiet, the shoes whispered presence. The home was not empty. Someone was watching. And second, For those less tangible presences, spirits, witches, beings with ill intent. According to folk tradition, such forces could be bewildered by human clothing and form. Placing the shoes outward suggested movement. Ongoing, alert, aware. Superstitions held that malevolent spirits were often drawn to stillness, to emptiness, to a house where no rhythm of life stirred. But the shoes, pointing out like sentries, hinted otherwise. This home had life in it, and it knew you were coming. Shoes have long held symbolic power in human history. In ancient cultures, they marked boundaries between sacred and profane. In some societies, one removed them before entering a temple. In others, a shoe was tossed onto a roof during weddings to bless fertility. Even the Old Testament mentions the giving of a shoe in legal contracts as a sign of transfer and agreement. Shoes touch the ground, where energy, danger, and spirit might reside. And yet they also protect us from it. They are boundary keepers. In medieval Europe, shoes were often placed in odd locations for reasons that went beyond storage. Some were buried beneath thresholds or within walls during construction. These concealed shoes, discovered centuries later in crumbling homes and ancient chimneys, were believed to attract and trap harmful forces. The idea was not to repel, but to distract. A malevolent spirit entering the house might see the shoe, mistake it for a person, and become confused, circling endlessly, forgetting its purpose. But the outward-facing shoe on a doorstep offered a variation on that theme. It wasn't hidden. It was visible, silent, and deliberate. A warning, not a trap. Some traditions believe that witches, particularly those walking under cover of darkness, could be stopped by disorder. A neat row of shoes could cause a moment of mental hesitation. But if the shoes were facing out, as if someone had just stepped through the doorway, the witch might falter, thinking she had been spotted or followed. In other stories, the spirit had to follow the direction of the shoes, turning away from the door instead of entering. Either way, the shoes didn't just sit, they pointed. Of course, not every household used the practice in the same way. In some areas, only children's shoes were used, tied with string and left dangling above the door. In others, they were combined with ash, herbs, or iron nails. And sometimes the shoes weren't real at all, just carved imitations, symbols of shoes etched into the stone or wood. There's a certain elegance in the simplicity of it. In a time when locks were crude and lanterns dim, and most doors were little more than planks set on hinges, this act of setting out a pair of shoes became a form of quiet resistance, a humble defense. You didn't need to shout or fight or fear. You just needed to place your shoes carefully, as if saying, "This place is guarded." Interestingly, the placement of shoes as guardians wasn't only about warding off danger. It was also about maintaining rhythm. In homes where tradition ran deep, shoes left outward at night were sometimes collected and reversed in the morning, brought inside, warmed by the hearth. The ritual repeated itself day after day, offering not just protection but a kind of comfort, a routine that made the uncertain world feel just a little more navigable. These customs echoed the broader pattern of pre-modern life, where survival depended not just on strength, but on rituals, signs, and silent contracts with the unseen. You hung garlic not because it always worked, but because it said, "We are prepared." You scattered salt, or tied string charms, or placed your shoes outward, not to guarantee safety, but to live in accordance with the rules of a world that was never fully visible. In wealthier homes, the tradition sometimes carried over, but in subtler forms. A carved boot at the threshold, a pair of ornamental slippers left in the entryway. Not worn, not used, but displayed. The symbolism remained even as the materials changed. And in cities, where danger came less from wandering spirits and more from desperate men, shoes could still signal, "Someone is inside. Think twice before entering." Eventually, the practice faded from daily life. Shoes were stored in closets, hidden away. Modern homes no longer needed such symbols. And yet, echoes remain. In some cultures, it is still considered bad luck to place shoes on a table. In others, shoes at the door are a sign of respect, of transition, of entry into sacred space. And then there are the stories of old women who insist on placing their slippers a certain way before bed, of houses where a single boot remains near the doorway, long after its owner has passed, perhaps for memory, perhaps for comfort, or perhaps, in some quiet, ancient way, to keep watch. So if you ever pass a threshold and see a pair of shoes placed just so, neatly aligned, toes facing out, pause for a moment. Someone, once, might have done the same, not because they feared what waited in the dark, but because they believed in the power of a simple gesture, a signal, a message to the world. We are here, and we are watching. And that, in the still hush of the evening, was often enough. Keeping dogs indoors as living alarm and talisman. Imagine a small cottage on the edge of a village, its walls packed with straw and clay, its hearth glowing with a soft red pulse as the evening cool settles in. The fire murmurs quietly. A pot hangs over it, swaying ever so slightly, and curled close to the warmth, just within the outer ring of soot and stone, lies a dog, eyes half-lidded, tail tucked, breath steady. Not a guard dog in the modern sense, not a soldier, but something quieter, something older. A watcher, a warning, a ward. In the pre-modern world, dogs were never just pets. They were woven into the very fabric of survival, not only as herders, hunters, or vermin chasers, but as household guardians in a much broader sense. Their value extended far beyond teeth and bark. A dog indoors, especially one who slept close to the fire, was believed to sense what people could not. Ill will, misfortune, spirits, the subtle shifting edge of what was coming. Dogs, it was said, could see death before it entered, hear footsteps not yet walked, growl at intentions, not just intrusions. Their senses were keener, yes, but also perhaps more attuned to that space between known and unknown, the living and the not quite yet happened. Throughout rural Europe, keeping a dog within the home wasn't merely convenience. It was protection, not just from burglars or wild creatures, but from the inexplicable. The sudden illness, the bad luck, the presence that made candles flicker and babies cry in their sleep. A dog sleeping peacefully near the hearth was a reassuring sign. If the dog stirred, ears twitching at nothing, gaze tracking the corner of a room with no visible guest, it was time to pay attention. Time to hush the children and check the door. Time to light another taper or say a quiet prayer. And so, dogs became more than companions. They became talismans, not worn on the body or strung from rafters, but living, breathing guardians whose very presence altered the mood of a home. This belief stretched back centuries. In ancient Rome, inscriptions sometimes read cave canem, beware of the dog. But the warning wasn't just for thieves. Dogs were sacred to deities of passage and protection, such as Hecate and Cerberus. They guarded not only property, but thresholds, physical and spiritual. In Norse mythology, too, dogs and wolves circled the gates of the underworld. In Celtic traditions, the black dog often appeared as an omen, but sometimes as a guide or protector, depending on the region and the context. The meanings varied, but the connection remained. Dogs lived close to the line between worlds. Their howls, their silences, their gaze fixed at nothing. These were interpreted as signs. In more practical terms, dogs inside the home were ideal sentinels. They barked before humans heard a knock. They stirred before a stranger crossed the lane. Their ears caught the shuffle of someone stepping too softly. Their noses flared at unfamiliar scents. In one-room homes or small timber-framed halls, this early warning system was indispensable. But beyond mere utility, the symbolism ran deeper. A dog was a presence you could trust, a creature that loved without condition, yet never let its guard fully drop. Children slept more soundly with a dog curled nearby. Travelers felt safer breaking bread in a house where a dog dozed peacefully by the hearth. Even among strangers, the presence of a calm, contented dog suggested safety, order, and good intentions. In many regions, people believed that a dog could draw out illness or evil. If a child was sick and the dog refused food or whimpered when near, some took it as a sign that more than mere sickness was at play. Conversely, if the dog curled beside the ill child, head resting across a limb, breathing evenly, there was hope. Animals were thought to be judges of invisible forces. Their instincts were taken seriously. They were listened to with the same attention one gave to dreams or sudden chills. Not all dogs were equal in this regard. Certain colors or breeds held particular meaning. Black dogs, for instance, carried mixed associations, sometimes feared, sometimes revered. White dogs were often seen as pure, even holy, and might be invited indoors during storms or funerals. In Scotland, small terriers were called fire dogs, and believed to bring good fortune if they chose to sleep near the hearth without coaxing. You might imagine a family at supper. A quiet night, simple food, the smell of herbs and smoke in the air. The dog, whose name isn't spoken too often, it's just him or our one, shifts, lifts its head, and lets out a low, unsure whine. Forks paws. Eyes meet. Someone goes to check the door, not because they expect a thief, but because something might be wrong. The dog has sensed it. Sometimes, nothing came of it. The dog would settle again. The moment would pass. But the instinct to trust remained. Even the act of feeding a dog was layered with meaning. Scraps were not tossed casually. A dog that lived indoors, close to the fire and the children, was fed with quiet respect. Bread crusts dipped in broth. Bits of fat saved and set aside. To feed the dog was to nourish the household's first line of defense, not just in body, but in spirit. In times of mourning, dogs often behaved strangely. They'd stay near the body, refuse to eat, or bark once, then fall silent. These behaviors became part of the pattern, the ritual, the rhythm of grief. Dogs, it seemed, knew before we did. They mourned with us, sometimes ahead of us. Of course, not all households kept dogs indoors. In wealthier homes, dogs were kept in kennels or courtyards. Hunting breeds, pampered lapdogs, or war hounds bred for spectacle. But even then, stories lingered, of noblemen who let a favored hound sleep beside their child's crib, of queens who wept harder for a dog than for a fallen knight, because something in their gaze, steady, unblinking, without agenda, felt ancient, beyond rank or wealth. Today, many of these meanings have faded. Dogs are still loved, still trusted, but the sense of spiritual utility has softened. Yet echoes remain. We still glance at our dogs when something feels off. We still speak to them in moments of fear or sadness. We still believe, quietly, without saying so, that they understand more than we do. And so, you can imagine it again. A cottage, a fire, the wind outside, tugging at the shutters, and the dog, old, faithful, silent, watching the door, even in sleep. A living line between comfort and chaos. A heartbeat wrapped in fur. A talisman that breathes, marking door handles with charcoal during plague seasons. Imagine a narrow lane winding through a quiet town. The cobbles are uneven, slick with yesterday's rain. The air is heavy, still and watchful, as if the street itself is holding its breath. You pass closed shutters, drawn curtains, and doors that have not opened in days. But one detail stands out. A dark smear, faint but deliberate, arcs across the handle of a low wooden door. Charcoal, Not ash from a hearth, not random soot. This was placed with care. It means something. In plague seasons, those long, tense months when illness crept through streets like mist, there were few reliable defenses. Medicine offered little comfort. Rumors traveled faster than facts. And in the absence of certainty, people turned to quiet, symbolic warnings. Among the most common, a simple charcoal mark upon the door handle. It was not a regulation. It was a message, one not spoken aloud, but understood by all. In some villages, it was a streak across the handle. In others, a rough X drawn beside the latch. Some smeared the entire doorknob black, dulling the metal shine so that any hand reaching for it might hesitate. The form varied, but the meaning did not. Someone inside was ill, or at risk, or simply unwilling to invite the outside world in. Charcoal was chosen not only for its availability, but for its clarity. It was immediate, unmistakable, a material born of fire, yet cold to the touch. It lingered on fingers, stained cloth, and marked any who ignored its warning. In towns where plague passed like shadow, charcoal served as a soft but powerful barrier. This practice was often spontaneous, passed from household to household through observation, not decree. During outbreaks, whether bubonic, typhoid, influenza, or unnamed fevers, trust became a currency more valuable than coin. And nothing spoke of cautious honesty like a blackened handle. It said, "Do not knock here. Do not lean close. Do not wait for a reply. We will not answer, and you are safer for it." Of course, not all marks meant sickness. Sometimes, the charcoal was a precaution, a signal that the family inside was in isolation, perhaps due to a recent loss, or a brush with travelers, or simply fear. In this sense, the mark became more than just a health warning. It was a request for privacy, for space, for mercy. For neighbors, it created an invisible perimeter. Children were told to keep their distance. Traders might leave bread or milk near the step, but few lingered. Messages were delivered with long sticks or tossed through windows, and the charcoal mark remained until the danger passed. Rubbed clean by hand when it was safe again, or tragically, when no one remained inside to remove it. Interestingly, the use of charcoal was also layered with older meanings. In many cultures, blackened markings at thresholds had long been used to repel evil spirits or signal mourning. During plague seasons, these older beliefs fused with practical purpose. The line on the handle was both a charm and a choice. It said, "We acknowledge what is here. We will not hide it, and we ask you to turn away, for your sake and ours." In some communities, the marks were refreshed daily. A ritual, quiet and steady. A father rising before light to smudge the door once more. A mother checking for rain that might have washed it clean. In this small act, there was control. Something to do when so much felt beyond doing. The marks also told the story of time. Entire streets might bear them for weeks. Then one house would wash theirs away. Then another. Gradually, cautiously, life crept back in. But some doors remained black for far too long. A handle unstained for months might signal good health. Or abandonment. Or worse, and not all who approached respected the mark. Thieves, taxmen, or those driven by desperation might try the latch anyway. For them, the charcoal served as a test, a line between those who understood the rhythm of village life and those who would ignore it. The practice, like so many others born in crisis, faded when peace returned. Charcoal no longer stained door handles in towns where doctors carried thermometers and laws replaced superstition. But in some remote corners, during times of renewed illness or unfamiliar fever, the old ways returned. A dark smear on a metal latch. A silent plea. Stay away. Today, the gesture might seem strange. We have warning signs, quarantine tape, sealed wards. But the logic remains the same. The desire to protect, not just oneself, but the unknown passerby. To leave a mark that asks nothing but caution. So if you ever see a faint black line on a door, perhaps in an old photo, or described in a family journal, remember that it was never random. It was a symbol born from care. A message made not with words, but with ash. And in the rhythm of their lives, it was enough. A small, quiet act. A charcoal line. And behind it, a world waiting to breathe again. Sprinkling salt across thresholds before dusk. The light fades slowly in a village where time is still marked by the arc of the sun and the rhythm of the hearth. Somewhere, a church bell tolls softly in the distance. Shadows stretch along the ground, and a hush begins to settle over the world. As the sun lowers toward the horizon, householders begin a quiet ritual. Often without speaking, often without looking up. A small pouch or bowl is retrieved, sometimes kept tucked near the fireplace or in a cupboard. Inside, salt. Not for seasoning. Not tonight. This salt is meant for something older than food, older even than language. With careful fingers, they take a pinch and move to the door. A fine line is scattered across the threshold. Sometimes it's straight, sometimes curved slightly, depending on the hand, but always across the opening, between inside and out, between the known and the unknown. This is the evening rite of salting the threshold. A simple act, repeated for generations, believed to guard the family through the long hours of night. You may have passed through hundreds of doorways in your life, never once imagining that a line of salt once meant protection. But to those who lived by the rising and falling of the sun, the boundary between day and night held weight. And salt was their shield. Salt has long been seen as something more than a mineral, more than a preservative. In nearly every culture, it is tied to ideas of purity, permanence, and power. It preserves meat, wards off decay, and, perhaps most importantly in the minds of past centuries, prevents the invisible from crossing into the visible. In early European households, especially those without locks or formal protections, the doorway became the most sacred of lines. It was the place where things might enter, not just people or animals, but other forces harder to name. Spirits, malice, misfortune. As dusk settled in, that risk grew. Night was not simply dark. It was unstable. It brought illness, strange dreams, the fear of things not quite seen. And so, just before the sun dipped away, families laid down this thin line of salt. It was, in its way, a line in the sand. A final defense. You can imagine the motion. A woman, perhaps, stooping slightly as she sprinkles the salt. Not hurried, not dramatic, just part of the day's closing tasks. In some households, a whispered word accompanied it, a prayer, or an old phrase passed down from elders. In others, silence was preferred. The salt itself would know what to do. Some poured it in a long arc across the threshold. Others made small piles at the corners. A few traced patterns, a circle, a cross, or a symbol specific to the region. But the intention was always the same: to purify the threshold, to close it against intrusion. Salt's power was believed to stem from its incorruptibility. It could preserve meat for months, hold back rot, and keep food safe even without fire. If it could keep flesh from decay, why not a home from evil? Its whiteness, pure and grainy, stood in contrast to the dark forces believed to gather beyond the edge of the hearth. The belief wasn't just European. In Japan, small bowls of salt, known as morihyo, were set near doorways to ward off impurity. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, salt lines were used to prevent spirits from entering tents or homes. In ancient Rome, salt was used in ritual offerings, tossed over the shoulder or into the fire. Across centuries and continents, the instinct was remarkably similar. Salt marked safety. But it wasn't infinite. Each line was temporary. Each evening required renewal. Salt scattered one night might be swept away by wind, by footsteps, or by the ordinary business of the household. So it became a rhythm. Just as one might bank the fire, bolt the shutters, or gather the children inside, the salt too was renewed. A ritual not of fear, but of care. Of course, not everyone believed. Even in the medieval period, there were skeptics, those who saw such practices as old wives' tales or peasant superstitions. The church at times discouraged these folk rituals, but others embraced them, integrating the salt line into Christian blessing rites. Holy water might be added. A priest might sanctify a pouch of salt. What began as folk belief became, in places, liturgical, and yet the practice endured even in households that never saw a priest. Because it wasn't about doctrine. It was about safety, about habit, about the quiet peace of doing something. Anything to hold back the things that might come in the dark. In some villages, children were warned never to step over a salt line too quickly. It was said to weaken the protection. Dogs were occasionally kept from sleeping near the door, lest their paws disrupt the salt before midnight passed. And if, by morning, the line was broken, some took it as a sign, a disturbance, a warning, or simply a reminder that nothing lasts forever, and care must be taken again tonight. Even today, remnants of this belief remain. Some still toss salt over the shoulder when they spill it. Others place salt bowls near entrances during times of illness or grief. We may no longer believe, consciously, that salt can repel spirits. But something lingers, a whisper of the past in the pantry of the present. So imagine yourself in one of those old cottages. The floor is swept. The fire burns low. Outside, the last orange streaks of sunlight disappear behind the hills. You take the small bowl of salt in your hand, step to the door, and with a motion repeated for centuries, scatter a line across the threshold. The wind might sigh at the window panes. The trees might creak in the night. But inside, for now, the house is sealed. The salt is in place. The family rests, and darkness holds no claim. Planting thorn bushes beneath windows as barriers. Imagine a small timber-framed cottage nestled in the curve of a lane. Its windows set low beneath the thatched roof, their wooden shutters gently creaking in the wind. Just beneath those windows, thick and deliberate, grows a hedge. Not soft, not ornamental, but bristling, tangled, and sharp. Hawthorn, perhaps, or blackthorn. The kind of growth that catches at sleeves, snags shawls, and draws blood from unwelcome hands. It's not just a garden feature. In centuries past, it was a decision. Thorn bushes, grown beneath windows and along property edges, were one of the oldest forms of passive defense. In villages, towns, and scattered farmsteads across Europe and beyond, people learned quickly that not all threats arrived with fanfare. Some came quietly, under cover of night. And so the thorns grew, dense, stubborn, and often painful, to discourage what doors and latches could not. A low window, in an age before glass was common, was both necessity and vulnerability. It allowed light and air, but could be unfastened with little effort. Shutters offered some resistance, but could be pried. Hinges could be lifted. A strong hedge beneath the sill, by contrast, offered a different kind of message. You may approach, but not easily. You may reach, but not without pain. These hedges required patience. A thorn bush does not grow overnight. It is planted and waited on. Trained, pruned not for shape, but for density. In time, it becomes a kind of living wall, one that cannot be picked or broken with a blade. The more it is ignored, the more effective it becomes. Its twists and tangles deepen, its thorns lengthen, and the ground around it becomes a place of hesitation. There were practical reasons, of course. Thieves and prowlers were always a possibility, especially in times of scarcity. Windows made tempting entries, particularly in homes where valuables, tools, livestock feed, even stored food, might be kept close. A hedge thick with hawthorn or bramble made a silent deterrent. There would be no creak of a hinge, no broken glass to betray intrusion. Only a yelp, a scratch, or the sound of someone retreating with torn cloth and regrets. But not all threats were flesh and blood. In folk belief, the world was never wholly empty. Spirits, it was said, could gather near the edges, around chimneys, under thresholds, or at windows left ajar. The eye of a spirit, curious and invisible, might peer in. A dark force might seek entry while the family slept. But thorns, some believed, did more than block bodies. They confused the spirit, caught it, trapped its essence like a burr catching wool. The spirit would lose its way in the thicket and remain tangled until the sun rose. Certain traditions even instructed households to walk around their thorn hedges at dusk, whispering protective charms or weaving a thread of wool through the branches to tie the spirit inside. It was not just gardening. It was ritual, quiet, habitual, and rooted in a worldview where the natural and supernatural coexisted in every hedgerow. The species mattered. Hawthorn, in particular, held a special place in lore. Its white blossoms were beautiful but fleeting, blooming in May with a scent that some called sweet and others found unsettling. It was associated with both fertility and death. To plant hawthorn beneath a window was to invite a force that was at once watchful and forbidding, protective but never passive. Blackthorn, by contrast, was darker in leaf and mood. It blossomed earlier in spring, its twisted limbs and fierce thorns seeming to warn off even the sun. It was said to be a tree of boundaries, used not only in hedges, but in marking the edges of pastures, fields, and even old burial roads. Where blackthorn grew, spirits were said to pause. The practice of using thorns for protection extended beyond domestic homes. Some churches ringed their graveyards with hawthorn hedges to mark sacred space. Castles and manor homes, though fortified with stone, often employed thick hedgerows around outer buildings or servant quarters, where formal defense walls gave way to more everyday needs. Even inns and way stations, especially those along less traveled roads, used thorn hedges as both decoration and defense. And yet, to the modern eye, these bushes may seem merely rustic, picturesque, their symbolism buried, their meaning faded. But in their time, they were chosen, planted with intention, tended with care. There is a quiet irony in this form of protection. A thorn bush does not bark. It does not move. It does not require maintenance beyond the seasons. And yet, it speaks. It signals, without words, that a home is not unguarded. That whoever lives within has made a pact with nature to keep the unwanted out. Over the centuries, as window design changed, growing smaller, then larger, then fitted with glass and eventually with locks, the need for thorn hedges diminished. But they remain, in many places, along old lanes, beneath cottages untouched by modernity. Their purpose today may be more aesthetic than spiritual, but their history lingers in the shape of their limbs, in the way they lean outward defensive, still holding the memory of a time when every barrier mattered. So if you find yourself looking out of an old, low window and see the twist of hawthorn just below the sill, remember that it was not always placed for beauty. It was placed for safety, for spirit, for sleep. A living guard with no voice, no arms, and no need to move. Only to grow, and to warn, leaning a staff beside the door to claim presence. Imagine a quiet lane on the edge of a village, ruts in the dirt from passing carts, hedges trembling gently in the wind, and the evening light falling low across the stone thresholds of old cottages. Most doors are shut. A few creak open as children run in for supper. And near one such door, leaned just so against the frame, is a walking staff, tall, smooth from use, the wood darkened by years of handling. It might seem like a forgotten object, a simple tool left where its owner set it down. But to someone passing by, especially long ago, that staff spoke. Not in words, not in movement, but in meaning. It said, "This home is not empty. The master is nearby. Do not disturb." Long before security systems and keyed locks, presence had to be claimed in more symbolic ways. A staff by the door was one of the simplest and most respected of these signs. It served as both a message and a marker, quietly declaring ownership, presence, and return, even when the house itself was silent. The staff, after all, was no minor object. In many parts of pre-modern Europe, especially in rural areas and among pastoral cultures, a walking stick was as personal as a pair of boots or a favored cloak. It was not merely functional. It was a signature, shaped by the hand, worn by habit, and often passed down between generations. A man's staff could carry the marks of a lifetime. Notches for counting, carvings for meaning, bits of leather or iron fitted to the base. When leaned against the doorway, it acted as a placeholder for the man himself. He might be out in the fields. He might be gone to market. But the staff told anyone approaching, "He lives here. He will return. This house is not abandoned." This symbolism wasn't born from superstition alone. It had practical roots as well. In a time when many homes were vulnerable, thin doors, unglazed windows, no formal address, protecting one's property often relied on illusion. An unattended house was a tempting target, but a house that appeared occupied, even subtly, invited caution. A thief or enemy might pass it by. A spirit, if you believed in such things, might be confused. The tradition also found echoes in inns and communal dwellings. In some regions, travelers who lodged for the night would lean their staffs beside their room door to signal occupancy. The innkeeper could glance down the hallway and see, by the presence or absence of staffs, which chambers were taken. And in monasteries or secluded hermit dwellings, a staff by the door could mean something more spiritual. It was said that a wandering monk might leave his staff outside while entering a place of prayer, signaling humility, but also claiming temporary anchoring in that sacred space. Among shepherds, the staff had even more weight. It was both tool and symbol, used to guide flocks, to test terrain, to ward off animals. Leaving it at the threshold wasn't forgetfulness. It was communication. Anyone familiar with the rhythms of the countryside understood what it meant. Even in literature, staffs often appear not just as props, but as indicators of identity and motion. A hero leans his staff at the gate before entering to bargain. A weary traveler leaves his stick by the fire and collapses into sleep. The object always speaks for its owner, even in silence. As the centuries passed, this small gesture, the act of leaning a staff by the door, began to collect other layers of meaning. In certain regions, it was seen not just as a mark of return, but as a ward against disruption. To disturb the staff was to invite the owner's displeasure. In some tales, it was believed that moving a man's staff without his permission could carry consequences, spiritual or otherwise. And still, in some remote places, the staff took on near magical connotations. A carved knot near the top might be a protective charm. A ring of iron at the base might serve to ground ill will. If you lean the staff with care, angle just right, tip pointing eastward, it was said to draw strength from the morning light and hold it there. But even without those embellishments, the core idea remained powerful. Presence declared through absence. A way to say I am here, even when the body has wandered elsewhere. Over time, of course, the tradition faded. The staff became less essential. Roads were paved. Boots improved. Bags replaced the need for hand-carried items. And yet, the instinct to leave something behind as a symbol of return hasn't disappeared. A coat draped on a chair. A bicycle leaned just outside a cafe. A pair of gloves left on a bench. Each is a small echo of the same idea. Don't take my place. I'm coming back. In museums today, you might still find old shepherd's crooks or pilgrim staffs, worn smooth and curled like questions. But to see one beside a door in use, that's rare. Still, in some older villages, if you look carefully, you might notice a cane resting near a threshold. Maybe it belongs to an elder who lives within. Maybe it hasn't moved in days. But maybe it's still doing its job. Guarding, declaring, waiting. So if you ever find yourself walking down an unfamiliar path and see a staff leaning quietly by the door, consider what it once meant. A message in wood, a claim of presence, a quiet warning to any who might forget. This place belongs to someone, and in the hush of history, that gentle message was often enough, keeping sacred relics or tokens in niches above the door. Imagine a door, not grand or imposing, but familiar. Weathered wood, a latch that sticks just slightly, and above it, a shallow recess carved into the wall. You might overlook it at first, but inside, tucked carefully into this niche, are small, quiet objects. A bundle of dried thyme, a coin darkened with age, a slip of parchment bearing a saint's name. They sit still, undisturbed, their presence not dramatic, but deliberate. In the medieval and early modern home, these tucked-away tokens served a dual role. They were both spiritual safeguards and subtle signals to the outside world. To place a relic above the door was to mark the boundary between chaos and shelter, between the unpredictable forces of the world beyond and the ordered life within. Each object had meaning. A coin, for instance, might have been blessed during a festival or pilgrimage. To modern eyes, it might seem like mere currency, but once it passed through sacred hands, or was given in the name of a saint, it became something more. A charm against poverty, theft, or ill fortune. Not meant to be spent, but kept. Hidden, yet powerful. Dried herbs such as rosemary, rue, or St. John's wort were often bundled together, tied with twine, and placed in these doorframe recesses. Their practical use as insect deterrents or air fresheners merged easily with their symbolic value. Rosemary for remembrance, rue for repentance, wormwood to keep away malevolent spirits. Each had a story, a memory, a scent that meant more than just itself. And then there were the images, faded miniatures of saints, often copied by hand or printed on scraps of paper from a traveling priest or monastic scriptorium. These images weren't for viewing, like art. They were for watching. Watching the door. Watching what came and went, offering silent intercession. The practice of placing relics above the door can be traced back to both pagan and early Christian traditions. In pre-Christian Europe, thresholds were liminal spaces, neither entirely inside nor outside. The Romans called the household god of the doorway Janus, the two-faced figure who looked both forward and back. In many Celtic traditions, spirits were said to linger at doorways, needing guidance or appeasement to move on. As Christianity spread, these older ideas were not erased, but slowly reshaped. The door remained sacred, but now it bore a cross above it. Not always carved or painted, but sometimes implied, formed through gesture or in the quiet placement of holy things just overhead. In Catholic regions, it wasn't uncommon for households to keep a vial of holy water nearby, sometimes mounted directly into the doorframe. A visitor might dip their fingers before crossing the threshold, a reminder to enter not just physically, but respectfully. The door, after all, led into a space watched over by faith. For those who couldn't afford precious relics or professionally crafted charms, improvisation was key. A splinter of what's said to be from a sacred site, a stone from a saint's well, a bit of cloth that had touched a reliquary. These were the working-class relics, tokens with value not in gold, but in intention and belief. Over time, these niches above the door became layered with meaning. They were the household's first prayer, its unspoken creed. A neighbor passing by might glance up, and, depending on what they saw, know something about the family within. Are they devout? Are they cautious? Are they guarded or welcoming? The objects offered both blessing and boundary. Some homes kept their tokens openly displayed. Others concealed them behind small doors, shutters, or folded cloths. A visitor might never notice, but the family knew, and that knowing mattered, like a lock you trust not just for its metal, but for what it represents. In times of illness or unrest, these tokens took on even more weight. During plagues or famines, some households added to their niches. A rosary bead, a wax seal from a bishop's blessing, or a scrap of sackcloth marked with ashes. These weren't decorations. They were shields. Quiet, domestic armor against unseen enemies. In larger homes or manor houses, the threshold might bear not only spiritual items, but heraldic ones as well. A carved coat of arms, a family motto, a crest. These two functioned as symbols of identity and protection. But even there, tucked among the grandeur, one might find a faded saint's medal or a twist of herbs. Because protection, in the end, was not only for the grand. It was for the living, for the breathing, for the ones who slept just beyond the door. Even the architecture responded to this belief. In many parts of Europe, builders included intentional recesses, small hollows above doors or in lintels, designed for these tokens. They weren't structural. They were spiritual, designed not to hold weight, but to hold watch. And so the rhythm of life included this quiet ritual. A woman might change the herbs with the seasons. A man might add a coin after a journey or pilgrimage. A child, learning the practice, might be taught never to touch the items with dirty hands, and never to remove them except in prayer. If the house changed hands, the niche might be emptied, or, more often, left intact. Few were brave enough to discard such objects outright. Better to let them be. Better to let old blessings linger, even if you no longer knew their names. And so you can imagine it, can't you? A door half open, dust motes drifting in the slant of late afternoon sun. Above the frame, a bundle tied with faded string, a coin pressed flat with age, a paper image browned at the edges but still intact. They don't draw attention, they don't shine, but they wait, they guard. Even now, some country homes keep this tradition alive. In parts of Ireland, Poland, Italy, and beyond, you'll still find small doorframe shrines, often dusty, occasionally freshened, rarely explained. Because protection isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply there, above your head, watching quietly, letting the world know this space is held, leaving a bucket of water on the step to deter harm. Imagine a quiet morning in a small village before the bustle of the day begins. The ground is damp with dew, and the sky is soft with low cloud. A cottage stands at the edge of a narrow lane, its wooden shutters just beginning to creak open. At the doorstep, simple and unassuming, sits a bucket, filled nearly to the brim with clear, still water. No one seems to notice it. No one comments. But those who pass give it a respectful glance, and no one steps too close. This was no accident. In many parts of rural Europe, Asia, and beyond, placing a bucket of clean water just outside the door was a quiet but potent form of protection. It was not an official symbol, nor something proclaimed aloud, but like a broom propped against the wall or a sprig of rowan above the lintel. It carried meaning understood by all who shared the rhythm of the place. Water has long been seen as a liminal substance, neither solid nor air, flowing yet still, receptive yet resilient. It could quench thirst, cleanse wounds, and put out flame. But it could also reflect, absorb, and hold. This last quality, its power to absorb, lay at the heart of the doorstep bucket. During seasons of unrest or illness, or when a household felt it was the object of gossip, envy, or malice. Water on the step was believed to draw in that negative energy. Curses, whether deliberate or accidental, were thought to cling to a home's threshold, the place where inside and outside met. The bucket served as a barrier and a sponge, gathering unseen threats before they could enter. Some believed the water drew the evil in like a mirror draws a gaze. Others thought the clarity of the water confused harmful spirits, causing them to pause, hesitate, or lose their way. The water offered no resistance, only reflection, and in doing so disarmed. But the practice wasn't purely magical. It was also deeply practical. A clean bucket of water by the door meant readiness. If a fire broke out, it was close at hand. If someone returned from the fields or the market, they could rinse their hands. If a neighbor passed by and needed a drink, the bucket stood silently, offering. It was this blending of utility and belief that gave the ritual its staying power. Even the most skeptical neighbor could not argue with the usefulness of water at the door. The bucket itself mattered, too. It was often made of wood, bound in iron, its handle worn smooth by years of carrying. In wealthier households, it might be copper or tin, gleaming in the sun. But more important than the bucket was the water it held. It had to be clean, freshly drawn, preferably from a running source, and changed regularly. Stagnant water was not only unpleasant, it was believed to trap bad luck rather than neutralize it. Some families changed the water at dawn, others at dusk. A few did so at both, murmuring quiet words or crossing themselves as they poured the old water out, always away from the house, often toward a crossroads or down a slope. In this way, the absorbed harm was cast away, dispersed into the earth or the flow of a stream. Over time, certain superstitions grew around the practice. A dog that drank from the doorstep bucket was thought to take the household's luck with it. A visitor who kicked it over might be watched with suspicion for days. And if the water level dropped mysteriously overnight, it was said that something, or someone, had come calling in the dark. In some villages, water was added with small herbs, lavender, rosemary, vervain, plants long associated with cleansing and protection. A sprig floating in the bucket was both fragrant and symbolic, an extra layer of care in uncertain times. In others, a coin was dropped into the water, a modest offering to whatever forces might be watching. The reflection of silver beneath the surface was thought to distract wandering eyes and protect the home from envy. But perhaps the most powerful part of the ritual was its quietness. There was no confrontation, no display of power or warning, just a still surface waiting. It was a form of strength that did not shout, a way of saying, "We know the dangers, and we will not meet them with fear, but with calm, with readiness, and with clarity." This was the deeper rhythm of the bucket on the step, not just to deter, but to transform, to take whatever harm might drift toward the threshold and offer it no target, only stillness, like rain absorbed into the earth, like a harsh word met with silence. Today, few follow the practice. Doors have locks, cameras, and alarm systems. Protection is loud, visible, electronic. But in some quiet corners, the old ways linger. A pail of water left out, not for cleaning, not for thirst, but for peace, for memory, for a tradition that once saw magic not as spectacle, but as part of the everyday. So if you ever see a bucket on a step, clear, still, and oddly untouched, perhaps think twice before moving past. It may be nothing, or it may be something quietly waiting, quietly working. A small spell of water and wood, a safeguard older than locks. In the rhythm of their lives, protection was rarely forceful. It was patient, gentle, like a surface that holds reflection without judgment. Like water, doing what it has always done, watching, absorbing, and flowing on. Hanging woven wreaths as signs of seasonal guardianship. The door stands quiet beneath the slow turn of the sky. It is not grand, just wood, weathered by rain and sun, shaped more by use than by design. But above it, something softens the frame. A ring of branches, woven tightly. Twigs bound in a circle, decorated with dried herbs, small blooms, sometimes berries or bits of ribbon. It is not merely decoration. It is a signal, a sentinel. This is the wreath, humble, handmade, and hung with care. To modern eyes, it may seem quaint or festive, a cheerful ornament, perhaps for holidays or celebration. But for much of history, especially in rural communities, the wreath was something deeper, a sign of the changing world, a marker of time, and a guardian of the home. To hang a wreath was to declare a turning of the year, spring into summer, autumn into winter. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the world outside the door was shifting, and that the home within must be shielded, blessed, and balanced against what might come. These wreaths were almost always made by hand, often by the same person year after year, not for lack of artisanship, but because the act of making it was as important as the object itself. One might step into the fields or hedgerows with a small knife and a sense of what the season offered. Willow twigs for the base, perhaps, flexible, light, and easy to bend into a circle. Then hawthorn, if protection was needed. Lavender, if peace was desired. Rowan, to ward off the strange and the sinister. Each element held a meaning, not written in books, but passed through whispers and habit. Local customs varied, but the intention remained constant. This was not random foliage. It was a carefully chosen charm. The wreath became a circle of intent, woven with the hands, and hung over the entrance to speak for the household when no one was there to watch. You might imagine a woman, standing at the edge of her garden, selecting sprigs of rosemary for memory, or marigold for resilience, or a child sent into the woods to find small pine cones or ivy, depending on the month. In summer, bright blooms might be tucked into the weave, wild rose or chamomile. In autumn, dried wheat or oak leaves. Winter wreaths were simpler, sometimes bare, save for holly or bay, placed not for color but for power. Because make no mistake, these wreaths were not passive. They were guardians. Their circular shape symbolized continuity, protection without edges, a home encircled by intention. They hung high, not only to be seen, but to be effective. Some were replaced seasonally, others stayed up year-round, altered slightly as time moved forward. If a wreath fell too soon, it might be taken as an omen. If it stayed too long, some believed it could grow stale, its power dulled unless refreshed. In many parts of Europe, wreaths were tied closely to solstice or equinox festivals. The midsummer wreath, for instance, was often hung with flowers believed to catch fire from the sun, yellow, orange, radiant. In winter, evergreen wreaths symbolized survival, life enduring through the cold. They were not celebratory in the modern sense, but purposeful, signs that the house within had marked the passage of time and made its appeal to whatever forces watched from beyond the hearth. Interestingly, these customs were not always tied to formal religion. Though later folded into Christian traditions, Advent wreaths, Easter greenery, the older beliefs remained beneath. In some areas, it was considered bad luck to hang a wreath on the wrong day. In others, certain plants were never used indoors at all. Blackthorn, for instance, was thought to bring conflict if brought across the threshold. Some households added personal touches. A ribbon from a child's garment, a feather found at the edge of a field, a bit of iron wire for extra protection. Others kept the wreath simple. No color, no adornment, believing that the plants themselves spoke clearly enough. And it was not always plants. In more isolated areas, people used what they had. Corn husks, dried moss, even carefully bent animal sinew. The shape mattered, the symbolism, the sense of a circle holding something at bay. In some cases, wreaths were burned at the end of a season, intentionally, ritually, to release the old energy and make way for new. The ashes were scattered near the doorstep or returned to the earth. In others, they were composted or buried beneath trees. But always, the old wreath gave way to the new. To the people who made them, these wreaths were both familiar and sacred. Not worshipped, but respected. Their creation was a moment of stillness, a pause in the labor of daily life. And their presence at the door was a comfort, a sign that something, however small, however quiet, stood between the inside and the great turning world beyond. In time, many of these customs faded or were absorbed into seasonal celebrations. Wreaths became decorations, their meaning softened. But the instinct remains. Even now, people hang circles above their doors. At holidays, in times of grief, in hope, something in us still seeks the comfort of the round shape, the protective loop, the message written in twigs and stems. This house is not unguarded. This door is not bare. So imagine, once more, that cottage door beneath the wide sky. The light is changing. The air smells of wood smoke and damp soil. And above the entrance, a wreath turns gently in the wind, woven by hand, hung with purpose, and holding, in its silence, the long memory of those who once believed that such small things could keep the night at bay. Smearing honey on door latches as a blessing against ill will. It is midwinter. The light outside fades early, and the air carries the scent of frozen bark, ash from nearby hearths, and the faint sweetness of something preserved. Inside a modest wooden cottage, the fire burns low. The family has gathered for the evening. But before sleep, before the shutters are drawn and the latch is fastened for the night, one more task is quietly completed. A spoon is dipped into a small earthen jar. Honey, amber and thick, glistens in the firelight. And with a finger, the woman of the house dabs a small smear onto the inside of the door's latch. Not for taste, not for repair, but for peace. In parts of medieval and early modern Europe, especially in colder northern regions, it was customary at certain times of the year to anoint the threshold with honey. Not the threshold itself, but the latch, the point of contact, the mechanism that separated the outside world from what was kept safe within. Honey, to these communities, was more than food. It was a symbol, a quiet one. It represented plenty, preservation, sweetness, and, most importantly, peace. To smear honey on the latch was not a charm in the theatrical sense. It was a gentle invitation. Let what is good enter, and keep discord at bay. This was often done around midwinter, when the nights were longest, when scarcity knocked loudest, and when the veil between past and present, spirit and flesh, seemed thinner than usual. The year had turned. The days would begin to grow again, and in this narrow crack of time, people reached for rituals, not grand, but small, meant to shape the season ahead. The latch was the perfect place. Not quite inside, not quite out. It was touched every day, many times a day, by the hand of the living. It bore the pressure of return and departure. It was the first thing seen by those who entered, and the last thing secured at night. Smearing honey there gave that spot intention. It made the act of closing the door not just practical, but symbolic. The honey was sometimes warmed slightly first, stirred by hand to make it pliant. In wealthier homes, the honey might be spiced, infused with clove or cinnamon, not for flavor, but for extra blessing. In simpler households, whatever honey was available sufficed. It didn't take much. A dab with a fingertip, a line traced along the iron or wood. People believed that such sweetness at the point of entry softened the spirit of any who approached. That envy, bitterness, or malevolence would pause there, confused, perhaps, or appeased, and turn away. Others said it was simply a way to remind the house itself that it was a place of peace, a form of speaking through action. And indeed, for many centuries, action spoke louder than words. Most households could not read charms or prayers, but they remembered motions. They remembered timing. A touch of honey on the door, just as the year turned, just before the coldest stretch began, was a form of promise. We may have little, but we welcome kindness. We protect joy. We wish to begin again. In some folk traditions, especially in Scandinavian and Baltic regions, honey was used in conjunction with bread or grain. A pinch of flour might be added to the smear, or a crumb of bread placed on the sill. These gestures honored both abundance and humility. You offered something sweet to the threshold, hoping that what passed through would echo it in kind. In other areas, the honey was applied not just at the latch, but also to the corners of the doorframe. A small cross might be traced, or a spiral. The shapes were not uniform. What mattered was the intent. That sweetness should mark the passage. That the household should be sealed not in fear, but in blessing. There were practical echoes to the act as well. Honey is preservative. It doesn't spoil. It repels rot. In a time when spoilage and decay were constant enemies, of food, of wood, of health, the act of applying honey to a doorway carried a kind of practical symbolism. May this home endure. May it be safe from what would fester or fail. Honey also had connections to bees, and bees to the spirit world. In many old European cultures, bees were messengers. It was said that bees had to be told when a family member died, that they listened to secrets, that they carried news from hearth to heaven. To apply honey to the door might be seen as a silent offering to the bees, or to whatever unseen ears still listened at the cracks. Children were often taught not to lick the honey from the latch, not because of waste, but because it wasn't food. It was a promise, a charm, a prayer disguised as sweetness. To consume it was to disrupt the pattern. And yet, like many such rituals, the practice faded over time. As door latches changed, from wood to iron, from handmade to machine-made, the act lost its place. Doors became barriers of steel and brass, and symbolic smears gave way to bolts and locks. Honey returned to the table. Still, in some corners of rural Europe, especially in homes where grandparents passed down quiet customs, the practice remains. Not often, not loudly, but remembered. A dab of honey on the inside of the latch. No ceremony, no explanation, just a soft touch. A sweetness where the hand lands. A hope, perhaps, that what crosses into the home will carry that same softness within it. So if you ever find yourself in an old house during winter, one that smells of hearth smoke and dry herbs, and you catch the faint shimmer of something sticky near the door latch, it may not be a spill. It may not be forgotten. It may be an old, gentle blessing. One that says, here, we keep sweetness close, even in the coldest months. Even when no one is watching, etching family symbols above the door for lineage protection. Picture an old cottage standing quiet on the edge of a wind-swept hill. Its stones are irregular, its roof low and moss-softened. The wooden lintel above the front door has darkened with age, warped slightly from years of weather. But just above it, carved carefully into the grain, is a mark, faint, almost worn smooth, but still there. A symbol, a set of initials, maybe a strange, looping sign whose meaning is long forgotten, but whose presence persists. To the modern eye, it might look like a decorative flourish. But centuries ago, these etchings served as more than embellishment. They were boundary and signature, warning and welcome, and most of all, they were lineage, cut into wood or stone not just for beauty, but for memory, for protection, for permanence. Across medieval Europe and well into the early modern period, it was common for households, especially those with land, trade, or status, to mark their homes with simple carvings. Sometimes it was the family's initials, sometimes a stylized symbol or personal sigil passed down through generations. These were not noble coats of arms, nor grand heraldry. They were quieter, humbler, and yet in their own way, just as proud. These marks declared, "This is ours. We belong to this place. And this place belongs to us." They were carved once, carefully, and then left to speak for themselves across the decades. You might find them above the lintel, near the threshold, or even tucked under the eaves. In timber-framed homes, they might appear along the beams. In stone cottages, chipped into plaster or mortar, or painted in ochre and soot during construction. Some were geometric, interlocked triangles, stars, or spirals. Others bore the characters of the household's initials, father and mother, or the founding ancestor. A kind of signature, inscribed not with ink, but with blade and purpose. Part of their function was legal. In some regions, particularly where land rights were inherited or disputed, marking a dwelling with a family symbol helped establish continuity. If two brothers argued over who had claim to the house, the carving served as silent testimony. If a tax collector passed by, the mark told him who he might find within. In trade communities, it acted like a business sign, declaring that here lived a smith or a weaver or a miller of such and such a name. But beyond law, these symbols spoke to something older, something deeper. They were protective. It was widely believed that a household's strength extended beyond the living, that the ancestors watched, not from heaven, not from some far-off place, but from the very structure of the home, from hearth and beam, from the carved mark above the door. To deface the mark was to invite misfortune. To ignore it, to intrude without respect, was to risk stirring the attention of those who had come before. Folk tales abounded of travelers who ignored such symbols and paid dearly, losing their way, becoming ill, or suffering misfortune until they offered proper recognition. Some regions even had annual customs of re-inking or recarving the mark, often on midwinter's night or during harvest, to awaken the household's protection anew. The belief wasn't necessarily that the carving itself held magic, but that it connected the present to the past. That through it, the living home could recall the memory of all who had lived before. And for those who grew up beneath such marks, the meaning was deeply personal. A child might trace the etching with their finger on rainy days, learning the story of each stroke. Who made it? What it meant? How their grandfather had once added a second line to commemorate a marriage, or a birth, or a rebuilding after fire. Over time, the mark could grow, layers of history encoded in a few square inches of wood. In some houses, especially those belonging to yeoman farmers or skilled tradesmen, the mark evolved into a kind of visual shorthand. The shape of a goose for a fowler's family, a plow for farmers, a twisted thread for weavers. These weren't just signs, they were stories. Generations etched in lines. And then, of course, came the subtle warning, the unspoken message to anyone approaching from outside. You are not the first to stand before this door. Others have come. Others still watch. Even if no one was home, the carving above the lintel suggested memory, vigilance, presence. It discouraged opportunists and soothed the faithful. Sometimes these carvings were paired with sacred symbols. A simple cross, a Marian mark, an M with curling arms meant to invoke the Virgin's protection. In plague years, some families added lines in chalk, temporary symbols to renew their mark's strength when fear ran high. In border regions, where raiding was a constant threat, it's said that some carved symbols doubled as messages to neighbors. An urgent mark, a scratched warning, a hidden code that could be read only by those who knew how. A door's carvings might hold both history and strategy. Of course, not every home bore such marks. It took time, and tools, and a certain pride. But in those that did, the carving became a quiet centerpiece, rarely spoken of, but never forgotten. Today, few remain. Weather has worn them, paint has covered them, renovations have erased them entirely, but occasionally, In a village older than memory, you'll still see them. A faint swirl in the beam above a farmhouse door. A pair of letters, nearly lost in the brickwork. Or a strange, looping knot whose meaning no one remembers, but no one removes. It's easy to walk past them now, to miss them, but they're there, holding a place, carrying a name, speaking softly for those who once lived and watched and hoped behind that door. And perhaps, in some small way, they still do. Drawing circles in ash around the hearth to guard the center. Imagine a quiet room, lit only by the orange flicker of firelight. The last light of day has long since faded, and the wind presses softly against the walls. Inside, the air is warmer, thick with the scent of wood smoke and stew long finished. The family has gone still. Perhaps the last cup has been drained, the last stitch pulled through thread. And now, one simple act remains. A hand reaches down with care. Not hurried, not careless, and with the tip of a soot-darkened finger, begins to trace a circle in the scattered ash that surrounds the hearth. One slow arc, then another, completing a shape that is not meant to trap, but to hold. A ring, not of magic as we think of it now, but of meaning, a quiet boundary, a final gesture that says, "This day is done, and all within it is safe." For many in the pre-modern world, the hearth was not simply where meals were cooked or warmth was found. It was the center of everything, the literal and spiritual heart of the home. It was where fire met family, where stories were told, where children took their first steps, and the old took their last breaths. The hearth was memory, sustenance, and shelter in one. And because it was central, it had to be guarded. Circles traced in ash each evening formed part of that guardianship. Ash, the soft gray residue left behind by flame, was more than waste. It was considered a purifying substance. What remained after fire had cleansed. It marked what had burned, but also what had endured. And so, to use it in ritual was not superstition, but a kind of logic, a way of saying, the fire has fed us, warmed us, and now we ask it to protect us. The act was often quiet, performed without words, perhaps while others prepared for bed. The circle did not need to be large or perfect. Sometimes just a faint ring, other times multiple lines, layered like ripples in still water. The gesture itself was enough. It is believed that this practice existed in variations across many regions, especially in rural Europe, where oral traditions wove together elements of Christianity and older folk customs. In Celtic lands, circles were symbols of wholeness and protection. In Slavic regions, ash was known to drive away bad spirits. In Germanic folklore, it was said that a circle could keep wandering souls or ill-meaning entities from crossing into the home's sacred center. Sometimes, the ash circle was traced just once, at the close of the day. Sometimes, it was redrawn after the fire was stirred or new logs were added. In some traditions, the circle was not closed entirely, but left with a gap facing the door, inviting only those with kind intentions to enter. These small, thoughtful choices carried quiet weight. Imagine growing up in such a household, watching your grandmother lean over the hearth with steady fingers, drawing the same curve her own mother once did. No explanation, perhaps, just the instinct to carry on what had always been done. In some households, this ritual was accompanied by murmured prayers or blessings. Not loud or formal, just a few words, perhaps from the Psalms or older fragments remembered half in dialect. Something to settle the space, to ease the invisible edges of night. Others believe the circle helped contain the fire's spirit itself. That flame was not only light and heat, but a living thing, capable of anger or favor. By encircling it gently in ash, they ensured its mood would remain calm, its power held just so. And it wasn't only spirits of mischief that were thought to linger at night. In times of hardship, Plague, war, famine. People were attuned to subtle shifts in fortune. A cracked hearthstone, a draft that hadn't been there yesterday, a dog that refused to lie close. These might all be signs that something unseen had slipped in. And so, the circle of ash became more than custom. It became necessity. During the harsh winters, when nights stretched long and illness came easily, some families added herbs to the ash before drawing the circle. Rosemary for remembrance, bay leaves for strength. These, crushed underfoot and mixed with soot, gave off a faint scent as the fire stirred. A kind of invisible incense, wrapping the room in layered comfort. In wealthier homes, the practice might be formalized, done by servants or fire tenders, taught with precision. But in humbler cottages, it was often a mother's hand, or a child learning by imitation. The circle wasn't always even. Sometimes the ash was sparse, but the intention remained intact. Draw the line. Close the day. Keep what matters inside. Of course, not every night was peaceful. There were storms, arguments, illness, times when the circle was forgotten, or when it was drawn with too much haste. And on such nights, if the dog barked without reason or the wind howled too long at the shutters, someone might rise from bed and retrace the circle. Just in case. Over time, the ritual faded in many places. Hearths were replaced by stoves. Families scattered across rooms rather than gathering in one. But the gesture lingered in other forms. In the way we turn off the lights in a certain order. In the way we check that the door is locked twice. In the way we smooth the blanket, settle the room, say something quiet before sleep. We are still drawing circles in our own way. And perhaps you've done it too, without noticing. Closed your day with a shape, a boundary, a line of calm drawn in the dust of routine. Perhaps that is its true purpose. Not to keep something out, but to keep something in. Warmth, memory, intention. So imagine it again, just once more. A hearth, low and glowing. A room hushed and safe. A hand moving through soft ash, not to erase, but to hold. The circle forms. The night settles. And the center of the world, for now, is sealed.